Good morning, everyone. How's it going? Good, good, all right. Yesterday we had Deacons Work Day here, and we had a number of people show up that some of them weren't even deacons. It was great. We had people working down here, replacing ballasts and lights, that kind of stuff. We had quite a number of guys up on the roof, and I was up there with them, and was cleaning off the roof so that it can be recoated, there was a lot of dust and dirt, and so last night I decided that I should probably take a Benadryl to help me sleep, and it ended up in my right lung. I don't know how I did. You're all shocked, right? How does that happen? Apparently, it's pretty common. You look it up on the internet. People go to take a pill, and it goes down their windpipe instead of going where it's supposed to go, and it ended up in my right lung. And so it's been an interesting morning, and the thing is, it should just dissolve and be okay, but it's irritated my lungs and my throat, and so I have some water over there. I might need to run over and get it, because as I talk, I have a tendency to go into these coughing fits that are really unpleasant. I will try to spare you as much of the unpleasantness as possible. I can't make any guarantees. What's that? Jack. Introduce Jack? I was wondering about that. Yeah, I wondered about that. Jack, can you come up here? So disregard my whole story about my lung. So, Jack, if you wouldn't mind coming up here. Thank you.
Trying to be helpful right away.
Yeah. So Jack's been with us for the last couple of weeks, and he's been leading worship. We found him through an agency that helps churches to resource worship people. But Jack is now our worship leader, and so we welcome Jack on board. It's great to have you. It's really good to have him. And so I want to encourage you to talk to Jack, and especially if you get the chance, make sure and have him tell you jokes, because nobody has better jokes than Jack. So please, yes, the first thing that I remember him doing the first week he was here, he was telling jokes to the rest of the band, and it was a great thing. So make sure that he tells you any of the jokes that he knows. You'll be blessed. Terrible. You'll be blessed. All right, thank you so much, Jack. Thanks for being here with us. All right, so here's the situation we are in. 1 Kings chapter 3. So if you have a Bible device, you want to turn there, that's great. Please feel free to follow along with us. Our passage is a little bit longer today than normal. We're going through this sermon series on a firm foundation. And the thing that's important to understand is that there really is only one foundation to build your life on that's solid, that's firm. And a lot of the problems that we experience in life is we start building the walls and putting the roof on and putting windows in and picking out the drapes of our life before we really have that foundation nailed. And that foundation, the only firm foundation of your life, is your covenant relationship with God. Outside of that, there is nothing else you can build your life on. And so we've been going through that and kind of showing how that is the case. And today we're talking about firm foundation and making wise decisions. Because let's face it, it's really kind of impossible to live a healthy, productive, blessed, and glorious, joyful life if you're not making wise decisions. And all of us have been in that place where we questioned our decision. I questioned my decision to take a Benadryl last night about 500 times between last night and this morning. And so the thing is, wise decisions are incredibly important. So we're going to talk today about how your covenant relationship with God allows you to make wise decisions in your life. And so if you turn to 1 Kings chapter 3, we have here the story of Solomon. And I'm sure you guys remember who Solomon was. Solomon was this guy who, was one of the sons of David, and he becomes king over Israel. And it says in 1 Kings chapter 3, starting in verse 3, it says, Solomon loved the Lord, walking in the statutes of David his father. Only he sacrificed and made offerings at the high places. Now, here's the thing to understand. This is before the temple was built in Jerusalem. And so they go through this period that's fairly long. If you remember back when they were in the Exodus, they had the tabernacle that they would make offerings of. Well, that's not really around anymore. There's no temple yet. The Ark of the Covenant exists, and a lot of these things exist, but they're in this kind of weird place right now. And Solomon is going to these high places to offer sacrifices. Now it says that he followed in his father's footsteps. Remember, David had a heart for him, and so far he's loving the Lord, and he's walking in that love of the Lord. Let's continue with verse 4. It says, "And the king went to Gibeon to sacrifice there, for that was the great high place. Solomon used to offer 1,000 burnt offerings on that altar. At Gibeon, the Lord appeared to Solomon in a dream by night, and God said, 'Ask what I shall give you.'" Now, it's important to understand here, well, if Solomon's worshiping at the high places, well, why is God blessing him? Well, he's worshiping God, he's just doing it not exactly as God wanted him to do. But the thing is that we know from the verse 3 that Solomon loved the Lord. The problem wasn't, his heart was in the right place, but he wasn't quite understanding or quite clear on exactly how he's supposed to do this. And so, but he's very generous with his sacrifice, incredibly generous with his sacrifice. And so God appears to him. He says, "Ask what I shall give you." Imagine how powerful that would be, that moment. Imagine God appearing to you and saying, "Ask whatever it is that you want, and I will give it to you." What would you ask for? I remember thinking about this passage a lot as a kid and thinking, wow, wouldn't that be great? I mean, it's almost like the genie with the 3 wishes, but this is only one. But it's God, so, I mean, you can ask for whatever you want. It says in verse 6, Solomon said, "You have shown great and steadfast love to your servant David, my father, because he walked before you in faithfulness and righteousness and in uprightness of heart toward you." Now here's the thing. Notice what he's saying about his father David. These are important words here. Solomon said, "You have shown great steadfast love to your servant." Steadfast love is a really important term here. It's a covenantal term. God is connected to his father David, and David in turn is connected to God, because he walks in faithfulness, in righteousness, and uprightness. There's a covenant relationship here. And Solomon is doing the best that he can. His heart is in the right place. His heart is oriented toward walking in a covenant with God the way that his father had done. He says, "You have shown great faithfulness and steadfast love to your servant David, my father, because he walked before you in faithfulness, righteousness, and uprightness of heart. And you have kept for him this great and steadfast love, and have given him a son to sit on his throne this day. And now, O Lord my God, you have made your servant king in place of David, my father. Although I am but a little child, I do not know how to go out or come in. And your servant is in the midst of your people, whom you have chosen, a great people, too many to be numbered or counted for multitude. Give your servant, therefore, an understanding mind to govern your people, that I may discern between good and evil, for who is able to govern this your great people?" Now, this important words here that he's using, this idea of I may discern between good and evil. That same phrase is used of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and it's the task of a king to know the difference between good and evil. That's the task of a king. And he wants to be a great king because he realizes that in his love, God has been faithful to David and put him on the throne. And this is a mighty calling. It's so good, it's so wonderful. But he realizes in his humility the lack of being able to do this. And so he reaches out to God to say, "Give your servant what he needs to be a good king, that I may discern between good and evil, for who is able to govern this your great people?" In verse 10 it continues, "It pleased the Lord that Solomon had asked this, and God said to him, because you have asked this, and have not asked for yourself long life or riches or the life of your enemies, but have asked for yourself understanding to discern what is right, behold, I now do according to your word. Behold, I give you a wise and discerning mind, so that none like you has been before you, and none like you shall arise after you. I give you also what you have not asked, both riches and honor, so that no other king shall compare with you. all your days. And if you walk in my ways, keeping my statutes and my commandments as your father David walked, then I will lengthen your days. And Solomon awoke, and behold, it was a dream. Then he came to Jerusalem and stood before the ark of the covenant of the Lord and offered up burnt offerings and peace offerings and made a feast for all his servants. Do you see the what do they call it? The arc of the story? He started off worshiping God, but worshiping at the high place. And then he went before God and he was humble. And he wanted God to bless him. He wanted a relationship with God where he would be what he needed to be so that he could fulfill the calling that God had given him. And God granted him wisdom, and now, do you see at the end, he awoke, he went to Jerusalem, he stood before the ark of the covenant of the Lord and offered up burnt offerings and peace offerings. There's been already a transformation. He has already become more wise. So, what do we learn from this? Well, I think we need to talk about three different things this morning. First, wisdom knows what. That's not a question. Wisdom knows what. Secondly, wisdom knows how. And finally, wisdom knows when. And these are important because if you're going to have a good life, you need to know these things. You need to know what, you need to know how, and you need to know when. So let's look at this first. I was reading a Time article, and in this Time article, the person who was writing it was a psychologist or a psychiatrist, and the article was about how self-love makes us lonely. And it was talking about how we have a culture of self-love. In fact, self-love is all over the place. It's really big in the wellness and health kind of world. And in fact, one of the things that this writer was perceptive enough to understand is that this has been being used to sell us stuff that we don't need, to sell us really high-priced stuff. You know, love yourself, take care of yourself, spoil yourself because you love yourself. Get yourself this nice thing. Buy this great thing for yourself. And this person was pointing out that the problem with materialism is that materialism is around satisfying our wants with things. Do you see the problem? You feel bored, you feel empty, you feel that lonely, you feel something, and so rather than reaching out for people, you reach out for things to try to fill that void. But the problem is you weren't made to be in covenant with things. You were made to be in covenant with God, and you were made to be in covenant with people. And so what's happening is that people who want to tyrannize you, who want to become rich, to profit from your loneliness, will encourage you to go deeper into the hole of loneliness, looking at your own life and loving and valuing yourself over anything else, and that traps you in this cycle of loneliness. See, the question really is this. When I say wisdom knows what I mean is this: wisdom knows what has ultimate value. Wisdom knows what has ultimate value. You see, the problem is that in our world, there's a lot of people who are smart. You can run into smart people all day long, and smart people will have a great command of facts, and they might know formulas, they might know all kinds of things, and smart people will know how to get things. I was watching a video this week about a guy who runs a channel, and he was showing in his channel how to cheat at games, basically. They're called exploits. It's really just cheating. What you do is you find little quirks in the game that allow you to take advantage of the fact that they missed something. And so, like in this game, you could put up your army to the highest point possible, and then at a certain time, if you turned it off and restarted it, it would keep those armies, but it would allow you to add the same number in addition, and you could just keep doing that to where you had an unstoppable force, and you could just obliterate all the challenges of this game very easily. Well, then he decided to turn his attention to the real world, and so what he does in a lot of his videos is he goes through and he shows you that you can exploit different loopholes in order to do things, to make money. And one of the first things he found in the YouTube algorithms a way to keep getting infinite amounts of money from them. Because you would do something that cost you a little bit of money, but the reward would actually turn around if you used it in a certain way, get you greater money. And so if you just kept putting in that amount of money and doing this, you could keep going infinitely. Now the thing is that they weren't dumb at YouTube. They figured out that he was doing this, and they put a stop to it. But then he just comes up with another video and another exploit. You see, the thing is, he's a very smart guy. And as a very smart guy, that intelligence helps him to get the things that he wants. But the problem is that intelligence doesn't always help you to want the right thing. It doesn't tell you what has ultimate value. And that's what wisdom does. Wisdom understands what has ultimate value. In fact, if I would try to categorize, because wisdom and discernment and knowledge and all these things are very interestingly linked, and it's hard to figure out in the Hebrew and in the Greek exactly what the distinctions between them are. But if I had to nail it down, I would say that wisdom is the understanding of what has value. And it starts with knowing what has ultimate value. The Bible tells us that the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. And that word fear is interesting because we think of it in terms of terror, and it's not completely without that understanding or that aspect of it, but it has more to do with respect or something that we don't really know how to categorize very well in our world anymore, which is the idea of awe, to be in awe of something. If you've ever stood in the presence of somebody who was very famous or very powerful, you might have experienced awe. If you've ever seen something that was so big and so great and so powerful, if you've ever watched a tornado right in front of you, if you've ever seen a huge storm and been out on the ocean in a boat, you might have experienced awe. Awe in the fact that something is so much bigger, something so much greater, something so much glorious, something so much more powerful than you, that you feel small in comparison. That is the feeling of awe. And in the Bible, what that means is you're starting to understand the value of God. When you stand in awe of God, you're starting to understand how truly powerful, how truly magnificent, how truly glorious, how truly compassionate, how truly loving is. When you get a picture of the difference in magnitude between you and God, and you start to see how valuable He is for all of His greatness and all of His glory, then you're on the path of wisdom. A lot of times in the Bible, it says something like it says in Proverbs chapter 16, verse 16. It says, "How much better to get wisdom than gold, to get understanding is to be chosen rather than silver." Basically, it's saying that wisdom is more valuable than those things. The reason is because wisdom knows the value of things. Wisdom knows the value of things. It knows that gold and silver are valuable, but it knows that God is far more valuable than gold or silver could ever be. It would never give up God for gold or silver. In Romans chapter 12, verse 1, it tells us, "I appeal to you, therefore, brothers, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, which is your spiritual worship." Did you get that? That we're to present ourselves as a living sacrifice. We're to give up all of ourselves. The Bible is making this great claim, and it's an astounding claim. It's making the claim that God is not only more valuable than anything you possess. The Bible is making the claim that everything you have and everything you are does not come close to the value of who God is. That if you present all that you have and all that you are and you lay it down as a sacrifice before God, that you have not paid too high a price for Him. It says that the value of God is beyond anything and everything that you've ever had, everything that you are, everything that you experience. It's worth all of it. And when you lay yourself down as a sacrifice, a living sacrifice before God, that you end up with a deal that is so much better than you could possibly have ever hoped for. It's like an infinite exploit. Because not only do you have infinite everything, but you have it for an infinite amount of time. Because what happens in a sacrifice is you lay everything of your life down for God, but God gives you everything that He is. That's what it means to have a covenant relationship with God. When you're in a covenant relationship with God, you have laid everything that you are, everything that you have, everything that you will ever possess or be, you have laid that down before God, and He has given you all of Himself. It is the treasure hidden in a field. And when you find it, you go out in your joy and you sell everything that you have. It is the pearl of great price. And when you see it, you know it is valuable beyond compare. We see this lived out in the life of Jesus. Jesus does what His Father wills no matter what. Everything that He does is the will of the Father. Everything that He does. Everything is laid down at the feet of His Father. The question is He a fool for doing this? Is He a fool? Does He understand the value of things? Is he misvaluing His life? You know, the modern gurus would say that you are the most valuable thing that you will ever possess, experience, or get to know. That you are of the thing of greatest value to yourself. That you should put yourself at the height of this value hierarchy. That's what our modern gurus would say. And so they would look at Jesus and they would say, Jesus, you are wrong. In fact, you might just be a fool. But is that true? In Revelation chapter 5, starting in verse 9, it says, "And they sang a new song, saying, Worthy are you to take the scroll and to open its seals. For you were slain, and by your blood you ransomed people for God from every tribe and language and people and nation. You have made them a kingdom and priests to our God, and they shall reign on earth. Then I looked, and I heard around the throne and the living creatures and the elders the voice of many angels, numbering myriads of myriads and thousands of thousands, saying with a loud voice, Worthy is the Lamb who was slain to receive power and wealth and wisdom and might and honor and glory and blessing." Do you see what happens with Jesus? Worthy are you to take the scroll and to open its seals, for you were slain, and by your blood you ransomed people for God. You remember that when Jesus was contemplating the cross right before He was to go to it, that He was alone and He was praying and He was sweating drops of blood. He knew what was before Him, laying everything down. He knew what was before Him. And the weight of that was very high. It wasn't that He just nonchalantly didn't know what He was getting into. He knew exactly what He was getting into. And yet He said, Not my will be done, but yours. And so He is worthy. What is He worthy of? Worthy is the Lamb who was slain to receive power and wealth and wisdom and might and honor and glory and blessing. You see, what wisdom is the valuing of God. And when you base your life on it, when you make it the highest ideal, when you make it more important than everything else, when you're willing to lay down everything in your life for it, you find that it's the most firm foundation, just as it was for Jesus. We value God because He is worthy. And God shares His glory with us when that happens. When you know what has value, you know what to pursue. You know what to chase after. You know what you should be going towards. And then you can apply your intelligence and your gifts in order to make that happen. While intelligence obviously makes you clever at things, it's so bad at getting you the right things. Only wisdom does that. I was watching a guy who talks about songs and stuff like that, and he was talking about Johnny Cash's cover of Hurt and the video behind that. It's something that I've mentioned before, but he was pointing out a few things that were interesting in it. And he was talking about that Johnny Cash had made this music video of this song shortly before his death. He was 71. He was in bad health. He had been in bad health for quite some time. He was in constant pain. And what had happened is he had seen himself go from the height of the music industry to being kind of obscure within that industry. And in the video, you see this because you see kind of these high points of his life. But in the end, the way that the video kind of intersperses these pictures of these high points of his life, it shows him sitting in his museum that's defunct. It's closed to the public. It's boarded up. And he sits there and you see different memorabilia and it's covered in dust and it's just sitting there. And he sits at this table that's full of this great feast, but it doesn't look very great. It doesn't look very appealing or appetizing. And one of the lines that he sings is, "You can have it all, my empire of dirt." And the guy in this video had read the authorized biography of Johnny Cash, and apparently his meaning behind singing the song was that he had realized in his life that he had traded a closeness with God for things that ultimately didn't have any worth. They looked in a certain moment in his life, in a certain season of his life, they looked like they had great value. It was great fun, it was glorious, but now at the end of his life, knowing that he was approaching his death, he looked at them and realized that they all were just passing. They all just had a season. That in the end, none of them had lasting value. They weren't the ultimate. And so he had traded something of ultimate value for something of less value. He was a very smart guy. He was a talented guy, but that didn't help him to get what had ultimate value. So wisdom knows what, but wisdom too also knows how, and this is super important for us to understand. Because just because you know what to go for doesn't mean you know how to go for it. So in Deuteronomy chapter 17, there's a really interesting passage here, and this passage is about the king. What is the king supposed to do? Deuteronomy chapter 17, verse 16 and 17, it says, "He must not acquire many horses for himself, or cause the people to return to Egypt in order to acquire many horses, since the Lord has said to you, you shall never return that way again. And he shall not acquire many wives for himself, lest his heart turn away, nor shall he acquire for himself excessive silver and gold." Now, if you know the story of Solomon, you'll know that although he had wisdom and he knew what had value, in the end, he wasn't able to walk the path of value. His heart turned away from a lot of these things, and he became foolish in many areas of his life. And the reason for that is simple, that Solomon is not Jesus. He's a fallible human being like us, and so there are times when he shows the wisdom that God had gave him, and there's times when he turns away from that wisdom. But the king has these rules that he's not supposed to multiply horses, he's not supposed to multiply wives, and he's not supposed to multiply gold and silver. Now, the question is, why is that? And the reason that this is important is because it's not just where you're going, it's not just finding out what has ultimate value and pursuing it, but there's also wisdom knows how to pursue things correctly. Now, the question is, why these things and how do they apply to our lives? Well, they do apply to our lives. Even though you're probably not thinking, I'm going to go out there and multiply horses, I'm not going to go out there and multiply wives, I'm not going to multiply gold. These things are important to you because they show you how to pursue what you're pursuing. Let's look at these one by one. Why is the king not supposed to multiply horses? Because horses are instruments of war. Israel was supposed to largely fight defensive wars, but God didn't want them going out and just fighting offensive wars all the time. Why? Because that would ruin the whole point of the Israelites being priests to the nations. They were supposed to be drawing people to God, not hitting them over the head with something. And so the kings of Israel were supposed to ride on donkeys and they weren't supposed to multiply horses. Why? Because the thing is that when you have power, you use power to achieve your ends. And so here's the thing. Solomon might have been, hey, I love God. These other people don't love God around us, so let's just have a whole bunch of chariots and we'll go over there and we'll take them over and we'll make them love God. Here's the reality. If you're wise, and this is super important to understand, if you're wise, you will understand that using power to achieve your ends is almost always a mistake. I'm not saying it's always a mistake. There are times when that has to happen. There are places for power. God institutes governments with coercive power for a reason. But the reality is that once you have power, the tendency that we have is to use it all the time because it's easy. And power will almost never get you what you really want. Here's the thing. How do you make somebody love you? Have you ever tried? Is it easy? Is it productive? Is it effective? No, it's not. Generally speaking, what happens is the reality of the world is that things operate much better when we don't use power. In fact, that was the whole purpose or the whole illustration of the failure of communist Russia, was that it was all coercive. And so what happened is as long as people were being watched and they were going to be punished, they would do exactly what they were told. But the minute that watchful eye was away, they wouldn't do it. And so their economy was always a shambles. Because you can only watch so many people over so much a percentage of the time. The reality is that power, you can't punish people into what you want. You become a tyrant. And when you become a tyrant, you're not a blessing to other people. And the reality is that if you know what is valuable, and you know God is valuable, and you know how He deals with you, God is cultivating you. God is using His love to draw you into His goodness. God is using His love and His power to make you more glorious. If you know that God has value, then that means that method has value, and that means that you should be using that method with the people in your life. Are you helping them to become more glorious? Are you cultivating the people around you into goodness? If you're doing that, then you're on the pathway to wisdom. If you're not doing that, then you might examine what you're doing. Because ultimately, glorifying others brings glory to us. Now, they weren't supposed to have a lot of gold and silver. Why? Because here's the thing. You might say to yourself, well, okay, power is not something that I'm going to use. I'll use a reward system like you suggest. I'll use money. I'll pay people to do what I want. Now, here's the problem is that leads to corruption. What do I mean by that? I mean this. C.S. Lewis talks about the fact that there are real rewards to things and there are mercenary rewards to things. And what gold and silver generally are, not all the time, but generally, they can become mercenary rewards. What does that mean? Well, here's the thing. Let's say somebody goes, hey, I just met somebody, I think I'm going to marry them. And you go, oh, well, tell me about them. And they say, well, they're rich. Well, what else? Well, they're rich. Well, are they nice? No. Are they pleasant? No. Do you like to be around them? No. Well, what do they have going for them? Well, they're rich. Now, C.S. Lewis would say that's somebody doing something for a mercenary reward. Marriage is the reward of love. But money is not the reward of love. So marrying somebody for money, that's not what you should be doing, right? You shouldn't be pursuing them for that. Why? Because we know that it corrupts the institution. So the point is this. Let's say you have a situation. Now, let me explain this first of all. There are times when you must use a mercenary reward. But you should not get to the point of relying on those all the time. And I'll explain this here in a second. How about right now? Let's say you have a kid. And you want your kid to learn to do chores. And so you say, if you do these chores, I'm going to do X, Y, or Z. Sometimes a child is not old enough, is not mature enough to know the value of the real reward of things. But you want to train the habit into them, and so you use a mercenary reward only to the point where they can understand the real reward. Because if they're motivated by the real reward, they cannot be unmotivated from it. You see what I'm saying? Like if they know, and that's what you want to do. You want to use, what are you doing when you use real rewards? You're actually drawing people into wisdom. You're drawing them into doing things because it has value. You're saying, rather than just taking money for this thing, do this thing for the real value that it has. It's drawing you closer to God. It's glorifying God. It's making you more glorious. You should be doing these things for that purpose. And you want to inspire people into pursuing the real reward rather than being lazy and using a mercenary reward. It's harder. It takes more dedication. But in the end, it's important. So, lastly, wives. Well, as you see in our text today, it starts off by telling us that Solomon, if you go back to chapter 3, verse 1 and 2, it talks about the fact that Solomon had married a wife for the purposes of making a treaty. And that's how it was done back in the day. You married these women and stuff like that because it connected you to powerful families, maybe other countries, all that kind of stuff. But the point is that you can start to rely on those things instead of trusting in God. If you're wise, you will love people, but ultimately only trust in God. Why? Because people are fallible. They're human beings. If you put them in the place of God, they will always disappoint you. And then you will end up being tossed back and forth. And people do this not necessarily only with individuals, but they do this with like the culture at large. There are so many people in our world that trust in what the culture says versus what God says. In fact, even a lot of prominent Christians, especially if they're in the media, you'll find what they'll do is they'll drop Christianity the minute that it becomes unpopular. Why? Because they've not followed this advice. Finally, we need to understand that wisdom knows when. In Ecclesiastes chapter 3, verse 1 and 2, it says this. It says, "For everything there is a season and a time for every matter under heaven, a time to be born and a time to die, a time to plant and a time to pluck up what is planted." And it goes on, and you probably remember that passage because you've heard the song, right? So the reality is that there is a time for everything. Well, here's the thing. Wisdom knows that time because wisdom understands God and what God is trying to do in the world. And so it recognizes the times for things. If you know what you're aiming at, you know what the time is for things. Think about this. When you were a kid, how many of you guys had to take out the trash? Anyone? Anyone? Okay, how many of you needed to be reminded when you were a kid to take out the trash? All the time, right? You know, you're building little structures and seeing if you can make it work, right? And then, do you ever remember a time when your parents told you to take out the trash, and you went and the trash was almost empty? But when you opened the trash can lid, the aroma hit you, and you closed the lid, and you said to your parents, "It's almost empty. It's not time to take out the trash." When your parents said it's time to take out the trash, did they mean like it's 3:40? No, when they said what time it is, it's time to take out the trash, they meant that the circumstances are such that the time has come for the trash to be taken out. The interesting thing is that the Hebrew word there in this passage about the different times to do things have to do not with a calendar or a watch. It has to do with circumstances. You know the time to do something because you know the circumstances. And you know the circumstances because you know what has ultimate value. You see? As an example, I've seen parents do this before. And this is almost every parent of a really young child will do this. But then almost every parent, when the child gets to be maybe 3 years old, will stop doing this. And let me tell you and tell me if I'm right or not. So here's the thing. You see a little kid and they go over someplace they're not supposed to be. And the parent says, "Johnny, come back." And Johnny just looks and goes, and then takes off. "Johnny, come back. Johnny, get over here or you're going to get in trouble. Johnny, get over here, you're going to do a spanking." And then finally they run over and pick up Johnny and they throw him in the air and they laugh and then they go, right? So the thing is that there's a time to play with the child and there's a time to discipline the child. But when you're first a parent, you love that kid so much. It's so great that you don't want to do anything that makes the child sad. Have you guys, any of you guys ever experienced this? Is it just me? Okay. Yeah, you do this, right? Because you don't want the child to be sad. And so and here's the thing though, the reason why almost every parent I know starts off this way and then drops it is because of the outcome. The outcome, right? What were you doing wrong? Well, you were putting the joy, the happiness, the emotions of the child, you were making that higher than the emotions of God. How does God see this? What will make God happy in this situation is way more important than what will make my son happy in this situation. It's way more important. Because it's ultimately going to make it better for everybody involved. It's going to make it glorious to God. It's going to make it better for me as a parent. And it's going to make it better for my child if I elevate God's feelings about this situation over my son's feelings about this situation. And when you get that wrong, you don't know the time. You don't know the time to discipline versus the time to reward. You mess it all up. But when you have wisdom, when you have that covenant relationship with God, you know the time. You know when to build up. You know when to tear down. And you have this wisdom because you have a close connection with God.
Thanks for joining our worship service today. Please follow us on our Facebook page where you can let us know about any needs or prayer requests you may have and keep up with the latest church news and events. You can also check out all of our past lessons and other videos by visiting our YouTube channel. At First Christian, we strive to be the presence of Christ in the world by helping others to believe in God's love for them, to belong to His church, and to become like Christ in their lives. If you would like to support us in our ministry, you may do so by giving online through our website at www.fcct.org or by mailing checks to the church. Have a great week.